Well, again, thank you so much, Vice-Chancellor. Let me see if I can actually live up to that CV, because again, it's not what you've done then, it's what you do now which makes a difference. So let's start. Good evening. Clearly immensely honoured and frankly a little daunted to be here. Being here tonight in Melbourne with you, with friends, is very special. To be clear, it's not Sydney, but to be clear, it also feels like home. I would like to thank Rupert Meyer, Charles Good, Tony Burgess for this wonderful invitation. To be here in front of so many Australia's great and good, humbling. Now, what I wanted to do this evening was to talk about markets. I know a bit about markets. I wanted to talk about markets. But I was asked to focus on my life journey. Frankly, a lot more difficult. I've never done this before, so bear with me, see how it goes. How to condense 64 years into less than 30 minutes is challenging. But let me try. Let me try. I'll be sharing with you some family history, how this influenced me, and the values, importantly, the values that drive my business and also my philanthropy. I'll then conclude by sharing some observations about the challenges and the opportunities I see in the world, and I hope I live up to that opportunity. Let me start with my journey. If there's one word to sum up my family's journey, it would be complexity. Complexity. The Hintze family originated in Germany. The Hintze family history originates in Germany. My forefathers moved from Höxter in Westphalia to Finland in the late 1700s. From Finland, my part of the family moved to Russia. Both sets of my grandparents left Russia for China, courtesy of the Bolshevik Revolution. My parents were born and married there. I too was born in China, in Harbin, on July the 27th, 1953. And for your interest, why that date's important, that was the day the Korean War ended. But let me ask you a question, did it? Post all the trauma, the family left China. We were stateless refugees. Australia welcomed us. I most certainly believe we won the lottery. I owe Australia an enormous gratitude. It was our safe harbour and a place to thrive. It might be a hackneyed phrase, but I always call it home. In Australia, post all this turmoil, we had to start from scratch. My father's first job was in a factory. Via education, he then progressed to be a chartered engineer. I certainly had to make my own way. My paternal grandfather, Mikhail Alexandrovich Hintze, as they call it in Russia, Hintze, was an entrepreneur. He had enormous aspirations. He set up a plywood supply business in Sydney, and critically, he borrowed money and made a substantial investment in a forestry business in Dutch New Guinea. This proved disastrous. Disastrous. It is now Irian Jaya, to be clear, and courtesy of the Indonesians, he lost everything when Indonesia invaded and expropriated all his assets. But fortunately, as part of his journey, he had a degree in Far Eastern languages, which of course included Chinese, that's where he worked. He got that in Vladivostok in 1922, before going to China. But after being wiped out, he needed an income. But because of his formal linguistic skills and degree, don't forget that, he found work as a translator in Japanese and Chinese, working for the CSIRO in Sydney. It was his education that allowed him to find work, live a sensible life, and yes, to pay the bank back. No, again, obligations. Now, personally, let's talk about me for a second. Personally, to make things more complex, in the 1960s, my parents divorced. I moved with my mother to live with her parents in their home in Wahroonga. It was extremely difficult. Her father, my grandfather, had glaucoma and was blind, so he couldn't work. My grandmother, who in her time had studied medicine, and no, she didn't get the degree, she studied medicine, had to work as a cleaner. Money was tight. All these family experiences taught me two things. Firstly, governments and leadership matter. They matter for better, for worse, and from my observation, often for worse. They shape outcomes. It is the basis of my interest in geopolitics, my keen interest in geopolitics. Governments can mess you up, right? But most importantly, it taught me the value and the power of education. Now let me move on to experiences. Money. I guess what we're trying to raise tonight. Money can come and go. It does not buy you friendships. It definitely doesn't buy you happiness. But what it does buy you is options. But with those options come obligations. As an aside, I wish governments would believe that. But I guess then it's not their money. So there we are. Let me give you an anecdote about myself to move the experiences on. I did odd jobs as a child, saved my Christmas money, and by the time I was 13, I'd saved a sum, which I thought was pretty much, of roughly $108, actually $108.64, but no one's counting. Yeah. It seemed a lot of money at the time. It was sitting at the Commonwealth Bank, earning 2% paid annually, okay? Now, imagine this. I'm at the bank up in Wahroonga, wandering around, and I see a poster for Chrysler bonds, Chrysler Australia bonds, that pay 8.75% interest quarterly. Now we're talking. I did the arithmetic. From first principles, I saw for myself the concept of compound interest. Wasn't all bad. And to be very open with you, I got excited. Imagine this, I got excited. 13, 14-year-old boy getting excited about this. I went there and I put $100, I went to leave a little bit aside, I put $100 into those Chrysler bonds. That was my first investment. My mother's father was impressed and wanted to know more. We spent a lot of time talking about it. But again, as an aside, I'm sure under today's ASIC rules, I would be prohibited from doing it, and David Morgan would be paying another fine. But you know, anyway, the world has changed. I enjoyed education. I was pretty good at school, but let's be clear, others were certainly better. Everywhere others are certainly better. I particularly enjoyed mathematics. Mathematics is the key to many things in this world. For me, it's an important lesson to learn. I also spent a lot of time in the Australian Museum in Sydney, which fed my curiosity. And I guess maybe that's why I'm fascinated by everything from astrophysics to healthcare to technology to anthropology and yes, to the markets. Now, from St Leo's College, Wahroonga, which aficionados will know Mel Gibson also attended, but so too did Frank Zipfinger, so I wondered what they had in common, Mel Gibson and Frank Zipfinger. I went to the University of Sydney to study engineering. I lived in St John's College, and to be clear, my world began to open. Illustrious contemporaries of mine included Malcolm Turnbull, who seemed to have beaten me at every election I got contested, and Tony Abbott, amongst others. I really got stuck in. I played sport, I wrote for Honi Soit, the newspaper. I became heavily involved in student politics, SRC, Union Board, Senate committees, AUS, International Student Travel Corporation, the whole thing. Okay, so I got stuck in. And yes, I studied a bit. I also drank a bit, but that's another story. And I delighted in the battle of ideas. After university in 1976, I joined the Australian Army. I wanted to explore the world and give something back to Australia. However, post-Vietnam, the Army was getting smaller, it was shrinking. And for me, but you know, that said, for me, the Army was a wonderful experience. I learned quickly that it was the warrant officers, not the commission officers who ran the place, life lesson, know who actually pulls the strings. The warrant officer's the key. It also taught me how to work and respect people with diverse range of backgrounds and abilities up and down the chain of command. I learned punctuality. To this date, I absolutely despise being late. Just can't stand it. So if anybody's coming with me, please don't be late, okay? Just a life lesson. It taught me tidiness, how to polish my shoes. It's sort of okay at the moment, how to polish my shoes, press shirts, sew on buttons. It taught me teamwork. I was promoted to temporary captain after 2 years, ahead of others, especially ahead of the Duntroonies. That was a good thing for me. It was my first success. I also made some great friends. One army friend of mine, Gary Van Ree, where are you, Gary? Down there? Gary Van Ree was one of them. But in fact, it was Gary who taught me how to properly iron my shirts. And to be clear, ironing shirts is not for wimps, especially if you do it with Gary Van Ree. Yeah. Now, after the army, I joined Civil and Civic as an electrical engineer. It was an interesting and challenging job. But when I was there, I felt my options were constrained. I applied for and was delighted to be accepted by Harvard Business School. My father, however, went absolutely apoplectic. To be clear, harsh words were exchanged. He was right at one level. It was a big risk. He simply could not understand why I would take all my life savings, almost $8,000, I can give you the precise number if you want, but almost $8,000, give up a well-paying job at the time earning $16,000 a year, where I was doing well, by the way, sell my car and borrow $32,000 to go to business school. He only saw risk and danger, and yes, I saw risk, but I saw opportunity, and I saw it was a way for me to change the narrative, and perhaps change the world, but definitely to change the narrative. So in 1979, I headed to the US and Harvard Business School, and to be clear, it was frightening going. A lot was riding on this move, but for me, business school was amazing. Business school not only gives you the skills, it enables you to connect classmates and the broader business community. HBS 82 was an amazing year. My classmates included Jamie Dimon, who I still keep in touch with, Seth Klarman of Baupost, Jeff Immelt of GE fame, and yes, our Helen Nugent, who's down one part of the room here as well. Helen was there with us as well. We had fabulous teachers. I was taught strategy by Michael Porter. Some of you might be reading some of his books even to this day. Taught finance by a guy like Robert Glauber, latterly Undersecretary of the US Treasury and CEO of NASDAQ, and a whole load of others. I could never have imagined meeting people like this, but there I was. The question which I'm often asked is, how did I go from finance to engineering? And let me give you the seminal point. The seminal point was when I attended a talk by John Mack from Morgan Stanley. He explained that the power in capital markets was shifting from traditional investment banking to the trading side of the business. SEC Rule 415, shelf registration, had been introduced. Market knowledge and the control of capital was on the trading side of the business, and I wanted to be there. I visited the trading firms, and I was excited about being on the trading floor. I just felt good about it. Stuff was going on. Now, that was 1982. The economy was not in great shape, and few people were hiring, but Salomon Brothers was, and aggressively so. I was hired into their training program, where I learnt an enormous amount. Many of you might have, but as an aside, many of you might have learnt Red Liar's Poker. And I'll be very open with you, it's not fiction. That was the firm where that was happening. And another point, since I was trading Yankee bonds in New York on the international desk, I had to get to the office at 5:30 a.m. Not a problem. I had to get to the office at 5:30 a.m. Getting up early was not something I was afraid of then. I'm not afraid of it now. And frankly, to this day, I relish it. So if I can give a life lesson to some of the younger people here, and some of the older people we've probably already past us, get up early in the morning and just go to work, please, right? Now, 2 years later, I joined Goldman Sachs, where I ran Euro convertible bonds and then UK equities. 12 years later, I joined Credit Suisse First Boston. And again, here's another interesting thing. Choose your mentors. I was hired by a chap called Brady Dugan into the equities division in London. 2 years later, there were changes inside the firm, and I needed to respond. And one of the options was to go out on my own and start a hedge fund. Now, Brady encouraged me. And he said the words which I still remember to this day. He said, "You've made me a lot of money and you'll be good at it." I think he might have been right. We'll see what happens tomorrow. But he seeded me with $200 million of his balance sheet, the equity division balance sheet. That was my capital, his balance sheet. But you need mentors like that. You need to seek them out. That was 1999, and by 2004, I'd returned him almost $500 million, but the firm was then 100% mine. The cash flows were then mine and the team's. Let me talk briefly about CQS. Our first client money was put with us in March 2000. We now have close to Australian 200 billion, we should work 200 billion, $20 billion for clients globally, successful and growing asset management business, offices around the world, New York, London, Hong Kong, and of course, Sydney. The head of our Sydney office, Louise Watson, is here this evening. She helps us serve the Australian superannuation and private wealth markets. And we provide investment solutions with credit focus. Now, to be clear, Louise Watson might be in Sydney, but she spends an enormous amount of time here. I see the T&Es. There's no question about that. I'm hugely proud of what CQS and its people have become. We're striving to build a firm that matters and makes a difference to clients and the community. Throughout my career, I've always sought to find an investment edge. Let me talk about that for a minute. The source of alpha. But in today's world, biggest challenge is the commodity is knowledge. Knowledge has become a commodity. And let me talk about what's happening here. The challenge of creating value. You start with noise. Plethora of prices, news, events. But you have to structure that noise into data. Those data sets enable you to create information, and when you do more work, you can get to knowledge. Great. But the problem is that with the education, the financial education, and the data services, many can get to that knowledge. You have to work hard, but you can get there. It's Bloomberg, financial qualifications, whether it's CFAs, CIs, MBAs. But let's be clear, where does the true alpha lie? Where does the true alpha lie? It lies in insight. And the only way to create that insight from knowledge is through imagination. Insight, knowledge, imagination. And for that imagination to be effective, you need context and deep analysis. One then needs to construct an investment, trade it, and risk manage it. Without risk management, it's all over. But you get paid for the information. You get paid for the imagination, is more the point. You get paid to execute and for the imagination. This is true in finance, and I sense it's true throughout business and industry. It's most certainly true in the art world. Success has given me the means to explore other interests and allowed me to give something back to the community and to those who have helped me and my family. Hugely important to me. My grandmother, Baba Tuya, instilled in me I tell you, every time I mention it, I find it very hard. She's very dear to me. My grandmother instilled in me the importance of giving back, and this has remained with me throughout my life. I know many of you in this room are extremely generous, both with your time and your money. Clearly, there's always much more to do. But let me talk about my philosophy. Let me talk about what's shaping this. There are two Bible quotes that stand out in this process. The first is the parable of the 5 talents. Matthew 25:14-30. Parable of 5 talents. Remember, it was the person who buried the money and did nothing with it who was admonished. Did nothing, was admonished. What does this teach us? It teaches us the value of hard work and that success is the product of doing the best you can with what you've got. Doing nothing is not an option. Doing something is an obligation. Frankly, no bludgers, all right? Doing something is an obligation. The second is Luke 12:48, which says, to those to whom much has been given, much is expected. In the more ancient tradition, tzedakah is what I also know about. Charity is important. It's our responsibility to engage. It is our responsibility to give back. Now, this leads me to 3 principles that shape my philanthropy and, frankly, my career. The first is the protection of the most fragile in society. The second is fostering aspiration. And the third, and equally important, is the respect for institutions. Fragile, aspiration, respect. That's where it is. That drives me. I've aspired to reflect these values both in my philanthropy, my community engagement, and my business. Society simply cannot rely on the public purse to get things done. Prior to the 20th century, it seldom did. I believe private giving is critical and crucial. One other problem is that the public purse can and often is extremely fickle. By definition, it's political. I believe strongly private philanthropy is better placed to enable, motivate and guide and partner with charities and partner with endeavour in society. We must all take individual responsibility to look after others. It's our obligation to give back. It's our obligation to engage. My foundation has worked with a diverse group of over 200 charities in the fields of education, health, the arts, the armed services and religion. We've given over 130 million Aussie away. But to be clear, I'm not done yet. The problem is I've got to earn some more to give it away, but we're not done yet. Personally, I have served and continue to serve on a number of boards and advisory committees. It's been driven by my values and my life's journey. I suppose it amounts to a very personal approach to philanthropy. I have to admit I know no greater pleasure than to give and to make a difference in the lives of others, whether it's through charity, business or the investment process. Let me change tack. I have a privileged view. My work, my interests, my travel, my philanthropy, and the people I interact with give me a very personal insight into many geographic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic events and the developments which shape the world. So how does Australia appear through this lens? We're a nation of 25 million people in a world of 7 billion people. 0.35% of the world's population. The good news is our GDP is 1.3 trillion, US 1.3 trillion, in a roughly 80 trillion globally. That's 1.6%, not bad. In the numbers, we might be small, but we punch way above our weight on the world stage. And to be successful, a nation needs to be educated, work hard, innovate, and have the rule of law. Property rights, rule of law. Success makes us richer, more competitive, and gives us a more interesting and meaningful life. Interesting and meaningful life, that's what it's about, surely. There are many examples of Australian success. For instance, Wi-Fi was invented by a chap called John O'Sullivan of CSIRO, less than 20 years ago, believe it or not. Where would the world be today without Wi-Fi? I know my bills would definitely be higher, but where would the world be? Huh? We also have significant artistic heritage. This evening we're privileged to be at the National Gallery of Victoria, Australia's oldest gallery. It's a marvel. But remember, the Felton bequest, private philanthropy, would it be what it is today without the private initiative? And for that matter, even the initiative of the Myers more recently. Don't think so. Now, our legal and financial system ensures property rights and the capital for growth. We have leading global businesses. Many are represented here this evening. I was going to list them, but there are just too many to go for it. In finance, Australia is a global leader. Many of our innovations are studied by regulators and market practitioners globally. Our superannuation system is the envy of many governments and was arguably Paul Keating's most far-reaching legislative achievement. Now let me give you an aside why I mentioned Paul. As an aside, my father worked with Paul Keating at the City County Council, where my father was an engineer in the 1960s. Paul was an office administrator. And yes, my father also could not understand why Paul left to pursue another job. There may be a pattern there, but trust me, there's no, I would never want to go into politics, it's just too hard, right? In agriculture, Australia has a huge opportunity. We're well positioned to benefit from growing demand as the world's population grows from 7 billion to 9 billion, and there's exciting opportunities in agri-tech to be even more effective on that. I'm personally convinced of this, and as you heard earlier, I've invested heavily in agriculture. It's a tough business, but it's a great business, and I'm very passionate about it. But you have to do it right. You have to work harder. The world is an incredibly competitive place, and it's getting more so. Australia has a built-in advantage through raw materials and agriculture. But our future edge will be driven through education and having the right regulatory and structural framework to allow efficient market functioning. And of course, our geography means we're well positioned to be a bridge to Asia and China. We're in a good place. Let me make some observations about China. China is often poorly understood. It is clearly a fierce global competitor, both geopolitically and geoeconomically. But note, whether you like it or not, but note, China will shape the world's future. Not alone, of course, but it will be a major player, a serious player. Its Belt Road Initiative is a world changer, and the rest of the world needs to be mindful of that. And just as an aside, the Belt Road Initiative, the road is the sea, very, very Chinese, right? But China is challenging the Westphalian order and global leadership. It's striving global leadership. And it's their strategic intent, the clarity of their vision, and their long-term planning execution are the keys to their success. Lessons to learn here. They're also very pragmatic about how they go about it. They rarely seek to impose their system or values on others when they invest. We often do. But it allows them to invest where others can't. Now, furthermore, BRI, Belt Road Initiative, is a driver of global growth. It is the major story for the next 20 years. It's one of the largest infrastructure and development projects in history, aiming to strengthen China's global economic leadership by linking the world to China, especially Europe and Africa. It's ambitious, 65 countries, 60% of global population, currently 30% of global GDP. To place the magnitude of what's happening into perspective, QE, we all know how QE changed the world. QE globally was, across all the central banks, was $8 trillion. They went into the banking system. M2, probably M3 is more places when it went. BRI is estimated to invest $10 trillion into the real economy, into infrastructure, over a long period of time. But that's M1, huge impact. It will have a much greater impact, and if you want some investing advice, follow the money. It's a huge deal. All of this is in the context of the US. The US is our global strategic ally, our long-term friend. We've been together a long while. But that said, we need to be more nuanced about our relationship and engagement with China. China is changing the world, and they are the emerging global superpower on our doorstep. And frankly, if you want a prediction, I predict they will be one of the world's reserve currencies before the decade's out. Not this decade, the following decade, but before 12 years. Again, a longer thesis, but they will be a reserve currency. Why not? But let me conclude. We're living through a time of unprecedented challenge and change. I believe the old world order is under threat. The institutions, governments, and the economic models we've grown up with are struggling, and they're becoming overly complicated, less effective, and furthermore, we see politically inspired regulation stifling innovation and enterprise. But given proper rules, markets, and to be clear, what are markets? Markets are voting systems, can solve the problems. Technology and big data is also changing the structure of the world. Technology empowers us. It helps us and gives us huge opportunity. However, technology is also changing communication patterns. And I would posit that social media can damage the democratic process. How? Because debate and discourse is being threatened by aggressive trolling. Longer conversation, but think about that. You can't raise your head above the parapet. Aggressive trolling. Debate is being stifled, populism is on the march, and the battle of ideas, which I cherish, will be undermined, is being undermined. All this serves to highlight what, in my view, is our most pressing need, and that is leadership. Clarity of vision, leadership. A generation of leaders must emerge with the strategic intent and the moral compass, and frankly, the bravery to tackle the challenge. Grasp the opportunities and join up the dots of our changing world. The countries that have that leadership strive and survive and thrive. But if you don't, you'll be back of the bus, right? On our part, we must recognise the world does not owe us a peaceful existence or a living even. We need to work hard, we need to be honest, we need to pursue excellence. The pursuit of excellence has always been my focus, as I'm sure it's yours. Now, at heart, I'm an optimist. I always have been. But to be clear, optimism is not an excuse for complacency. The solution lies in education, the fostering of enterprise, the creation of enterprise, and for us to all work hard for the common good. That's pretty much me. Let me finish. Let me thank you for listening to me so kindly and for the great honour you've done me this evening. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be in your company. Thank you.